I am extremely honored to be joined by Bruce Fein. His latest book is American Empire. In fact, we'll put it back up on screen for folks. American Empire Before the Fall. And we certainly are seeing the beginnings of the fall of this empire. He, of course, worked at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he served as Assistant Director of the Office of Legal Policy. He also worked in antitrust. He is a top advisor to many committees in Congress on constitutional law. He's a constitutional lawyer, and he is frequently quoted in the Financial Times of London, New York Times, you name it. And I think his greatest claim to fame is he is the senior policy advisor to Congressman and Dr. Ron Paul, who is now in the lead in Iowa and in Nevada and other key states, and is under an incredible bombardment of disinformation and propaganda from the corrupt establishment on both sides, the left and right, really certifying and signifying he's the real McCoy, not just his sterling constitutional voting record. And Bruce Fein has been an advisor of his for many, many years and has been working hard on the campaign trail with him. So I want to get into what's happening in the incredible police state expansion and also what's happening with Ron Paul. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and Ron Paul and all the support, I would say, is a manifestation of that. Bruce, thanks for joining us from D.C. What should we get into first, the giant police state power grab or Ron Paul's counter to it?
Well, I think we should get into the power grab first, because that really transcends any individual candidate. It's something that's going to come to haunt the United States, not only today, but in the future, if we survive as a genuine sovereignty that celebrates the Republic. And not only do we have this National Defense Authorization Act that Ron Paul condemned, that crowns the military with authority to detain any of us for life in the United States if the president says we're substantially aiding an associated force of the Taliban to attack coalition forces, a totally open-ended standard that now makes all of our liberties at the whim of the president. And then we have this continuity in government revelation that we discussed earlier, that suspends democracy, suspends the republic in the event of some so-called emergency that the president declares, or whatever standard of emergency is, and basically pits the government against the people. Instead of, that's an inversion of what the Constitution is about, which says we, the people, are sovereign, not the government. The government is the steward of our liberties, not the grantor of our liberties that are unalienable. And we also know from stories recently that we have surveillance drones on the southwest border, the government claiming they can surveil us from the day we step out, the moment we step out of our house until we go back into our bedroom without any probable cause, without any warrants. That's what's being made as a claim in the United States Supreme Court. We're using predator drones to kill people based upon secret evidence and secret law that the president says he can't disclose. There's no post-mortem. There's no way to hold anyone accountable for these assassinations that remind me of the Gulag archipelago of Solzhenitsyn, during the Soviet days. And it never ends. Always more encroachment on liberty, always more encroachment on privacy, and this futile quest for so-called absolute risk-free existence, which is a guarantee of simply detaining and arresting everyone on the theory that we're not all saints. A truly horrifying, I think, development. And the incredible thing is there's so little resistance. Rand Paul voted against these kinds of bills in the Senate, but it's really a handful overall. Only 13 senators out of 100 oppose this tyrannical rule. Ron Paul himself, I think, is the one person standing as a beacon there, recognizing and willing, unlike all the other candidates, to argue against this police state that makes safety as opposed to liberty and freedom. They are the touchstone of the country, even though the safety really is an illusion. Because when you create a belief that all citizens are disloyal, it'll create cynicism and a sense that the government then becomes illegitimate. And the greatest strength any country has is the allegiance and loyalty of its people. That's the greatest strength, and not the weapons, not the guns, and things of that sort.
Certainly. I mean, in the last few decades, the military-industrial complex, the big crony capitalist, non-free market mega banks, they've tried to keep the velvet glove on the iron fist, but now because Congress for now, 2 years has had a 9% approval rating, even liberals, big government people say they fear big government more than, the free market and corporations now. So there is an awakening. So I think the system is just dispensing with even the ceremony now. I mean, we were talking about this before we went live here. This was put on the White House website 2 weeks ago. Strategic implementation for plan for empowering local partners to prevent violent extremism in the United States. And it's a federal announcement saying domestic terror is the #1 threat, and speech criticizing the government, there's bizarre quotes in here, is aiding terror. And there's a President Obama quote in here where he says, I'll read it, "As a government, we are working to prevent all types of extremism." So now terrorism is extremism that leads to violence. Oh, see, the extremism, the talk leads to violence, regardless of who inspires it. And they go on to say, we're now worried about domestic groups, mainly right-wing. Quote, at the same time, countering al-Qaeda's violent ideology is one part of the comprehensive strategy to defeat al-Qaeda. Over the past 2.5 years, more key al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, have been eliminated or in rapid succession than any time since September 11th. We have strengthened Homeland Security and improved information sharing thanks to coordinated intelligence and law enforcement. Numerous terrorist plots have been thwarted, saving many American lives. And then they go on to say extremism, extreme talk is now aiding al-Qaeda. And so it makes this bridge. And if you read deeper into this, that they're going to use the NDAA, the military, basically against the American people. And as we know with the MIAC and Homeland Security reports that law enforcement sent me 3 years ago, none of this has to do with foreign threats or al-Qaeda and all this talk. It's always about Tea Partiers, Ron Paul, Bob Barr, constitutionalists. I mean, what does this signify as a constitutional lawyer and expert?
Well, it shows that the Constitution has been vandalized by the government, and the government needs to be held accountable. And it turns, I say, the idea of the republic on its head. The glory of a republic is liberty. The individual is the center of our constitutional solar system. In an empire, what we've got today, big government encroaching on all of our liberties is the earmark, and dominion and domination is the so-called glory of an empire. So we're so far away from the Constitution as it was drafted and understood and celebrated 220 years ago that we might as well be King George III. The President of the United States at present enjoys more authority than King George, who we overthrew because of his tyrannical powers in 1776. That is where we are. The Constitution has been so defaced, it's been so warped to just empower the government to encroach and stamp and destroy our liberties. And now when they're suggesting freedom of speech, the freedom to criticize the government, which should be welcomed since the government errs so often they need instruction rather than echo chambers, is now being made suspect. And indeed, we had the situation when the Patriot Act was passed shortly after 9/11, where the then Attorney General said anybody who criticized the Patriot Act was aiding and abetting the enemy. It's this delusion that causes the President Obama to say he doesn't understand why people in Afghanistan or Pakistan are trying to kill our soldiers just because we're trying to shoot them, maybe it's because if we stop shooting them, then they wouldn't be protesting with violence. And maybe if the government obeyed the Constitution, they wouldn't get the extreme speech. And I don't want to suggest that we're at the precipice of justifying, violent revolution. But we never should forget that in that Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson wrote and all of our founding fathers subscribed to, it says, when a government evinces a consistent train of action that displays an intent to reduce us to vassals, there's not only a right, a duty to change and overthrow the government and to supply a new dispensation that will protect our liberties. And the government's got to recognize you cannot continue to try to oppress all of our opportunities to speak and to argue and to display total and complete opposition to what we think are vandalizations of our constitutional rights and expect to retain power. One of the things that I think is most unfortunate because of the historical ways in which it in some respects was discredited, we need to go to the impeachment power. Congress needs to stand up to the plate. The members should be impeached themselves if they're not honoring the Constitution, and any president of the United States who says that he can use the military to arrest us because he says that he suspects we're substantially aiding Al-Qaeda or Taliban, we don't have a right to rebut it. There's no trial. There's no accusation. We just get to rot.
Yeah, why would Congress
should not stay there?
Why, there's several questions here, but it's all intriguing and is the big issue of the day. Why would the Congress try to give the president the power of a dictator? But before you go there, Ron Paul, the congressman, the presidential candidate, was on my radio show last Tuesday. And the video of it's gone around the web. It's been seen millions of times. It's radio/TV. And he said basically what you've said, but he said the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, establishes martial law in this country. And that's what Jonathan Turley said. That's basically what you've said. And literally more than 200, if you go to Google News and type in Ron Paul Alex Jones, from that interview, more than 200 newspapers, CBS, ABC TV, basically said Ron Paul's an extremist and dangerous, and groups said that's why he's being kicked out of the upcoming debate. This shows why he's so off track. Meanwhile, it's all over the news that they're putting military on the streets. In Illinois and Louisiana, it's on CNN 2 days ago. They're calling for troops to stop crime. The TSA is setting up checkpoints now on highways in Tennessee and other areas. This is all happening. They're saying they're going to do this, and then Ron Paul says, look, the emperor wears no clothes, and they howl that he's nuts. I mean, this is a weird paradox where everything you've warned about, he's warned about, others have warned about for decades is now manifesting, and they're separately pushing military on the streets, but then saying Ron Paul's crazy because he doesn't want it, because it doesn't exist. I mean, what is this?
Well, it's what Samuel Taylor Coleridge called a temporary suspension of disbelief. It's really Orwellian is the only word I can think of it. Call Ron Paul an extremist for defending and honoring the Constitution of the United States, and the non-extremists are the ones who are in favor of destroying the rule of law and imposing a government that we overthrew 220 some years ago called Great Britain with a monarch. I mean, it's hard to even have words to describe the absurdity of the characterization. Ron is the one who would have been there at the Battle of Bunker Hill. These guys would have all been with the Tories and with the king. And it is an example, however, that those who are in power don't want to yield it. And power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And you indicated, well, why has Congress crowned the president with such overwhelming authority? I say it's because Congress has become the invertebrate branch of government. And it wants to surrender all authority to the president because it doesn't want to be held accountable for anything. They feel they have cushy jobs. They get the money to come, to pay them their campaign expenses, and they'll sit there and act like they're in a movie. And they enjoy the momentary thrill of getting on television or radio from time to time. But they do not want accountability. They want to run away from accountability. That's why every time you come to a crunch where you're going to have to decide whether really you're going to cut government back, what does Congress do? Kick the ball down the road. 2 months, 6 months, 7 months, but never actually doing anything other than postponing today. It's like a little kid procrastinating. And that's the one element I believe the Founding Fathers were just stunned. They didn't think a branch would surrender power. But I think the reason why they misconceived how this has evolved here in 2011 is that the political parties have replaced the Constitution as the source of the allegiance of these members of Congress. They believe they're Democrats or Republicans, Dallas Cowboys, Washington Redskins, or New Orleans Saints, but they're not Americans. It's just their side, and they play like this is really just a game. It's not for the people of the United States. And that's why, hey, as long as their guy's in power, hey, give them all the power that you want, because that'll help you in the next election cycle. And it happens on both sides. And we've got to get rid of that idea. There's only one oath that members of Congress take. That's to the Constitution of the United States. They do not take an oath to the Republicans or Democrats or the president. The Constitution alone.
Let me go back to this question. I want to get into Ron Paul briefly before you got to go, because I know you're very busy, sir. You're heading up a lot of the campaign policies and things and supporting Congressman Paul. But, Bruce, looking at this, and I mean, really working in government, being around these people for decades, studying it, why are they moving so quickly? I mean, even I am shocked by the speed of it, and I've been seeing this develop for a while. People said, oh, you're being extreme, but now it's moving faster than I even thought, and instead of getting chills once a week of concern, I'm getting them every 30 seconds. I mean, I can feel the tyranny rising, not just see it. I can, intellectually it's right there, but also in my gut. Why is the system moving at light speed towards total despotism, classical, naked, on fire, North Korean style. Kim Jong-il is God, Obama is God. Anybody who doesn't like it's an enemy. What is driving this?
Well, it's a unique and curious feature of empire that as actual danger diminishes, the sense of crisis climbs. And there becomes this idea that, oh, we're super powerful, we're big government. There should be no risk at all. We need to control everything that moves, even though the genuine danger is close to zero. And that's just in the human species. When you give someone uncontrolled, unlimited power, they want to destroy any element of risk or contingency whatsoever. And they do that by exerting authority. Police, military, courts, money, or otherwise, taxation, regulation, or something like that. And that is what you would call the pathology of empire. Says this is crazy. Take a look, Alex, at this NDAA. When does it pass? 10 years after 9/11. 9/11, we had some fog. We didn't know whether Al-Qaeda had penetrated the country. Now we know how insignificant they are. They're international criminal thugs, but there are 50 of them in Afghanistan, and there are no cells in the United States. So why are we creating this draconian authority 10 years after we know it's irrelevant? And also think of this, Alex. There were no congressional hearings on the NDA. Not one. It emerged out of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Lindsey Graham, John McCain. It didn't go to judiciary. It didn't go to intelligence. There was not a single congressional finding that any of these authorities were necessary to make us safe. It just appeared. So you have to ask yourself, this is really stunning.
Well, that's like the Super Congress, where this committee of 12, when the president is the 13th, I guess Merovingian leader or whatever, they just should come up with a policy, and then you can up or down vote it, and then it kicks back if you don't. But what do you make then of all these moves towards Iran? I mean, is that just another desperate way to try to make themselves be the heroes of the people, claiming they're knocking out some new threat?
Well, absolutely. You can. The drum beats are already there. The Secretary of Defense, Panetta, had said just a couple days ago on CBS News, less than a year, Iran will certainly have a nuclear weapon, and that is simply not acceptable. So he's trying to already create the justification for going to war. And then I asked, well, Mr. Panetta, I was alive at the Cuban Missile Crisis. We have a retaliatory capacity that could incinerate Iran or then the Soviet Union. Doesn't deterrence work? It worked against the Soviets who had huge number of missiles. And when you talk about, well, Iran is the only people in the history of the world, deterrence doesn't work. They all crave self-destruction. I said, well, is that true? This Islamic regime, as zany and erratic as it is, they did release our hostages after a long, prolonged negotiations. They didn't go to war. They ended the war with Saddam Hussein over Iraq. They negotiated reparations when we shot down a plane by USS Vincennes.
And they've now accepted Israel, the U.S., and England launching covert strikes, including now it's coming out aircraft covert bombings, missile bases, you name it. They've even put up with that, and it's clear the West's strategy is to poke them until they do something.
Yeah, including assassinating their scientists. So they're like, listen, North Korea engages in rational behavior as well, even though it's got crazy leaders there. So deterrence works. So why are we going in there? And it's not to encourage proliferation. I'm not happy Pakistan has a nuclear weapon. I'm not happy North Korea has a nuclear weapon. I'm not happy they're nuclear weapons at all. But we have to deal with reality out there. Yeah. And deterrence is the way you prevent this from being used in a reckless way. There's only one country in the world that's ever actually used nuclear weapons. It's called the United States of America. And that's not to necessarily say that it wasn't appropriate to bring the war in Japan to a close very quickly, but other countries haven't enacted in a reckless way.
Sure, the truth is everybody knows the U.S., especially in the last 100 years, is ready and willing to go to war, and frankly the world's totally scared of the United States. But the problem is we've had these corrupt interests take it over, and so now the American people are endangered like a third world country from their own corrupt system using its military. In closing, in just 4 or 5 minutes, Mr. Fein, talking about the campaign, I mean, obviously, Ron Paul's winning by putting issues on the table, shaking things up. The mantra that he can't win, that mind control quacking is not working. So now they're pulling out every stop like they did with Rand, but that seemed to backfire. And some evidence shows that these latest attacks and, cherry picking things out of tens of thousands of pages and, diverse newsletters is going to discredit Congressman Paul. I've already seen his numbers uptick in the last few days. It looks like it is backfiring. So what do you see this corrupt system doing to try to stop him? And how are you advising him? I mean, if it's a public strategy, and everything Ron talks about is public, to deal with, obviously, a system that's going to pull out all the stops.
I think that the other efforts that, among others you described here, will be to try to take retaliation against broadcasters and people in the media, even such as you, who are supporting Ron Paul. That's what the military-industrial complex frightened is crazy like this. Northrop Grumman, Boeing, the big banks. They're fearful, so they want to take their advertising money and, oh, wait, we can't have these people who are in the media supporting Ron Paul. But the other thing that's I think will boomerang on those who are trying to attack Ron or pretend that he doesn't exist is, I think, that displays an arrogance that they are instructing the American people how to vote. And I think the American people resent that. They feel that they're entitled to make their own judgment based upon the facts, and they understand, because of Ron's body language, if you will, that he's not an egomaniac. He's not a Napoleon, unlike Newt Gingrich. He's there because he cares about the country, not about making $2 million speeches, if he doesn't win, or capitalizing on inside the Beltway lobbying contracts like the others do.
He's thrown himself into the middle of a bunch of scrofulous wolves who are attacking the old lion. Everybody can see it. They can tell he is a doctor trying to attend to the Republic, his patient. And I agree with you that it's only going to get crazier. And to see them in Iowa, to have the governor say a vote for him, just disregard it and it'll discredit our process. How dare Ron Paul discredit Iowa when he's the one trying to discredit Iowa's importance? I mean, it is so transparent.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Already thinking up excuses, as to why Ron Paul's victory won't mean anything. They're changing the goalposts, if you will. But I'd like to spend a few minutes before we close, Alex, on what I think is a total misrepresentation of Ron's detractors of his views on national defense. They're trying to suggest that he's code pink and he wants to be like George McGovern, or go humbly and lick the genuflect before all foreign emperors, which is absurd. Ron Paul is the most hawkish of all the candidates when it comes to defending America and Americans. Now, of course, he's not hawkish about defending Afghans or Iraqis or Yemenis or Burmese or Tibetans, because that's not the role of the United States government. Maybe Mother Teresa can do that. But he is the strongest on using all of our defense resources to defend us. A common defense is what the constitutional obligation of the president is. All of his rivals, really, they're weak on defending Americans. They're strong on defending everybody else in the world by sending military.
They won't defend our own borders.
In Darwin, Australia, we'll fight the Chinese. We'll fight everywhere except for Americans. And that is, in my judgment, insane. And your audience should think about this. If you had to talk to the family of the last soldier, Mr. Hickman, who died in Iraq, what would you tell that family what he died for? You would send him off to risk that last full measure of devotion. He's got courage, he's got manliness, and he doesn't know, and no one can tell him why he died. To my mind, that is a moral crime, if not worse.
He died for no-bid contracts.
Yeah, it's fair. Right, and that is clearly an utterly scandalous reason to send somebody to die. We should not be sending people to fight and risk their lives for the country unless we can write a Gettysburg Address and explain that's why they're out there, to make sure that liberty remained the glory of the United States of America. And Ron Paul is out there saying, yes, of course we're going to defend America. That's what defense is about. But it is not anticipatory wars everywhere around the world, not to defend Americans, but to defend everybody else who has no allegiance to the United States, pays no taxes here, doesn't obey our laws, but hey, it gives some people a thrill of domination for the sake of domination, bestriding the world like a colossus. But that's something for their egomania, and they ought to really leave the country if that's how they feel. Let's keep the United States a more perfect union and continue to celebrate and honor liberty just as the Founding Fathers intended and the Constitution instructs.
AmericanFreedomAgenda.org. Bruce Fein. Well, I could talk to you for 10 hours. I know you've got to go. Just briefly, Congressman Paul also drew the ire of dozens of major publications on my show last week when I said Fast and Furious now caught shipping guns directly into Mexico. And it's also been in the El Paso Times, Chicago Tribune. 8 federal agencies involved shipping drugs back in. New York Times even admitted it, and laundering the money. I mean, this is really all starting to come out. They can't hide stuff anymore in the information age. And Ron Paul said, yes, he should be fired, further investigated. It's clearly criminal. And they're like, how dare him say we should fire the attorney general? I mean, now, again, it's bad when someone's caught perjuring themselves, caught engaged in and CBS got the documents, Bruce, I know you know, where they were going to blame the Second Amendment. And Ron Paul said, yeah, it's a false flag. And so, and again, he's the bad guy. I guess if Ron Paul would have shipped the guns into Mexico, I mean, Bruce, would that have been okay?
Well, I think that the United States government should never be involved in crime. You know, it's interesting, Alex, that we find this same almost government entrapment or involvement in many of these terrorism plots, where they are the ones who are encouraging and coming to the table with the explosives and telling young Muslims, hey, don't you want to blow up the Sears Tower or the World Trade Center, something like that? You know, so they goes along for year after year. You know, why are we, as a government, encouraging, criminal activity? You know, there ought to be one standard. You comply with the law, period. And I agree with you, Alex. It's just intolerable. If the Attorney General didn't know, he should have known. And he should be fired for permitting people to do this without his knowledge.
Exactly.
You know, you're responsible for your subordinates. He's the Attorney General. I mean, remember all of the calls which I joined about Alberto Gonzalez? He didn't know who was getting fired, why they were getting fired. Well, it seems to me it applies equally to Mr. Eric Holder.
Well, you're right. Plus, he's been caught being involved in the whole thing. Amazing. Well, what else can we do to help get Ron Paul elected? Just stand by him and get the word out and realize this is the fight of Ron Paul's life.
Yes, and it's not just the fight of Ron Paul's life. What he recognizes, it's the fight for American freedom. And that's what's the greatness of his candidacy. It's not just, it really isn't about Ron Paul. And he'd continue to move on because he cares about the ideas. Those
sure, but I mean, we drafted him. He's the one, though, he's really in the arena. So if we drafted him, we better get behind him.
Oh, absolutely. We need to stand unswervingly behind Ron Paul. And, you know, whatever intimidation comes, we reject it completely. We act in a way that's civilized and decorous. We don't stoop to the other side's name calling, but no, we will not waver. We'll not be intimidated. You know, don't try to suggest that we're the revolutionaries. You know, you are the counter-revolutionaries. You are what the French would call the 18th of Brumaire, you know, Napoleon taking over the French Revolution. And that's what these guys are, trying to prevent Ron Paul's candidacy from succeeding, because he's taking us back to the genuine, authentic Constitution and understanding of the United States that, I repeat, the glory of the United States is liberty, not domination. And we flipped that. You know, now the glory of the United States and at least the ruling elite's mind is no military-industrial complex, banks, $29 billion to so-called prop up all these mega institutions who are concerned solely with money, to have no philosophy, no soul whatsoever. You know, that is what exactly we fought against in 1776. That's what's so stunning to me. That's what we risked our last full measure of devotion to get rid of.
Absolutely. If you're conscious and awake, it's so clear. Bruce Fein, have a great holiday coming up, and be safe. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you, Alex.
Well, that was Bruce Fein, author of American Empire Before the Fall, and the empire is out of control. It's run by finance oligarchs that are not free market, that make 40 to 1, 100 to 1 bets with other people's money like Corzine. I mean, we're in danger. And 99.9% of us, the world's going to become a worse place with these globalists in charge. And Ron Paul is really just a mainline constitutionalist. And the fact that he's so radical to the system shows how far these tyrants have taken us.